You are listening to All In, a podcast dedicated to helping you fulfill the mission of God in your life and around the world. I'm your host, Jeff Roper. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of All In. Have you ever had a great strategy, great plans, great ideas, and then something sideswipes it and you can't figure out what it is? It just feels like gravity keeps pulling you back down to reality. Well, it's called culture. There's an old saying in leadership that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now, these are famous words spoken by, attributed to Peter Drucker, but they're not spoken by him, but they're attributed to him, as is many good leadership sayings. But it doesn't matter who said it because it's still true. You know, we can glibly talk about changing culture, but changing culture is actually really hard. And yet, if you want real and lasting change, you must do more than change policies. You must change culture. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And I can think of nobody better to talk about this with than my friend, Tammy Dunahoo. Tammy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jeff.
Hey, it's a joy to be with you. Tammy is the vice president of the U.S. Foursquare Church. She is the senior director of Leadership and Culture+Care in the Foursquare Church. She's been in various denominational leadership roles since 2003. And Tammy's greatest passion is to educate, train, mentor, and sponsor emerging generations, because she loves seeing young leaders, women and men of every people group, living out their God-given design and creatively and effectively engaging culture. And she's been married to this fella named Gary for 40 years. And Gary's a friend of mine as well. He's actually coached me on in a number of areas. And he is an executive coach, and this couple is the real deal. I appreciate them a lot. So thank you again, Tammy, for making time to be with us.
Jeff. Very
Hey,
kind.
you know, your title, first of all, Vice President, Senior Director of Leader, Culture, and Care. What does that mean?
Well, that's a good question, Jeff. It's actually a new title, brand new, that I have been given by our new Foursquare president, who has asked me to focus on leadership growth, development, formation, whatever word we want to use. And part of my doctoral work that I've been doing for 3 years is really researching how do we do that best. And I went through a lot of the history of Foursquare and came out of it discovering that programs and initiatives have shelf life, but culture tends to last a long time.
Yeah.
And so this came out of a real desire to shift the culture of Foursquare. And my title is Cultivating a People-Centric Growth Culture in the Foursquare Church. And so that's what my title is trying to reflect.
Okay, great. Now, what is culture?
Culture is the norms, values, behaviors, artifacts. It's the thing that it's hard to describe. It's hard to use tangible things to define, but it's the environment that we live in every single day in our organizations and in society at large. One of the things I discovered in my research is that actually has a beautiful ancient history that comes from the Latin word cultura, which really means the environment in which something grows.
So just like how we will cultivate something, culture is what
Yes.
cultivates us.
Yes.
Okay. Now, so that leads into the next question. Why is culture so important then?
Because it affects everything we do more than we recognize. So our norms, the way we do things, whether this is in your family has a culture, and the organization, our society around us, there are norms, there are behaviors, they're the things that we value, that we'll pound the table for. They're the tangible artifacts that even come about and what defines us and what's important to us in our organizations or families.
You know, I heard recently somebody talking about culture, and they said culture is that which goes without being said.
Absolutely. That's why it's so hard to define.
It is, isn't it? And I listened to in graduate school, we had somebody giving a lecture about it and told the story about a fish swimming in the water, and somebody asked the fish, "How's the water?" And the fish goes, what in the world's water?
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
that seems to be what culture is. It's that which goes unsaid, but which shapes everything about us. Now, you've been doing this research in your doctorate program. What have been some of the key points of understanding or discovery that you've made in your research?
What I did, Jeff, is I researched 3 different churches, besides all of the reading and research, of course. But I did a field project where I went into 3 different churches, different sizes, different cultures in different areas of the US. And I spent a long time with all of them, really looking for what are the commonalities that emerged, no matter the size of the church, no matter the ethnicity of the church, no matter the part of the country, what was common of each of them. And I knew going in that each of them had a developmental bent. In other words, they were focused on making disciples, seeing Christ formed in people. That was their main thing. And I knew that about each of them. There were differences, but basically what emerged were 5 characteristics of the organization that were common to each of them, although they may have played out differently. And I named these culture markers. So there were 5 things that emerged in common about the organization. And then there were 3 things that emerged about how they went about growing people. So the practices, and I called these the collective culture markers and the individual culture markers. And that's what I wrote my thesis about.
Okay. Now, what what are the underlying currents or issues uh, that you find that are driving either you or the organization to want to shift the culture or maybe change the culture or strengthen or deconstruct parts of the culture? Are there particular things you've discovered that need to be, that maybe had their lifespan, but maybe they're not serving the current realities? What were those
Sure.
underlying issues?
I spent quite a bit of time through these years, Jeff, really investigating, listening to us talk often in the US about our aging ministerium, not enough younger leaders. I mean, we've been talking about this for decades.
Mm-hmm.
I went back and looked at the history of Foursquare, and I discovered that in the DNA on women and men, young and every ethnicity, and the focus was training missionaries and evangelists to send them out.
Mm-hmm.
That was the intention. There was very little conversation about the local church. And it seems our founder had the idea and the intent that if you make disciples and you train leaders, God will call them to the assignments. And so my basic premise came to be, Jesus said, I will build the church and you go make disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe in the church growth movement of the last 50 years, we have been in an era where we've reversed those roles. And
Okay.
we've been all about building churches. And Jesus said that would be his deal. We should make disciples. And so that's really what it's based in.
Okay.
When I look at our history, I look at our need, and you, of course, is very familiar with this, the 4-stage missiology
Mm-hmm.
that FMI has engaged. I would say in the US, once we got to stage 3, stage 4, we kind of got stuck there.
Hmm.
And we've not had a real emphasis in stage 1 and stage 2, making disciples, developing leaders.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems to be that's the center of gravity, not only within our own tribe of Foursquare, but every church that engages in mission. That center of gravity comes back to sustaining the life of the survival of the local congregation, not
Exactly.
necessarily the expansion. And did we end up developing inadvertently a culture that reinforces that now?
Yes, and that's why we are saying we're trying to move away from being a church-centric culture to a people-centric culture. It
Okay.
doesn't mean we're not going to support local churches, doesn't mean we're not going to plant churches and make healthy churches. We're just shifting our emphasis, believing that when we focus on the leader,
Mm-hmm.
disciples and leaders, the outcome, the result will be churches. Instead
Okay.
of strengthening churches, strengthen leaders,
Okay.
and the
It,
rest will follow.
and the rest will follow. That's great. Now, everyone loves progress, but nobody likes change. So, uh, What are some of the points of resistance that you may be facing culturally, and how are you navigating those?
Well, I find that the biggest issue is communication.
Okay.
And especially in today's world, it's a greater challenge than it's ever been. The three markers that at the immediate, Jeff, that emerged is having a common belief system, having a committed community, and a clear and consistent communication. Those were just compelling in all of my field research. And what I found is getting people to have a common belief system, to be a committed community around that, and then to send a clear and consistent message is a huge challenge today. We tend to go to steps 4 and 5, which is to build supportive and functional structures and systems.
Right.
It's just our nature because those are tangible and that's what we can just easily go to. Getting a common belief system and getting people committed around something is a challenge.
How do you go about doing that? I mean, you mentioned, and I'm thinking specifically within the demographic that would make up our tribe. I forget what the percentage is, but the vast majority of our demographic would be baby boomers, who are generally
Yes.
not known for having a higher priority on common shared belief systems and shared community. They're much more, hey, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm up to. We don't trust the man, we don't trust the system, just leave us alone. So you probably are going to
Yeah,
face a little bit of challenge with that, I would imagine.
oh yeah, it's a huge challenge. But here's the thing I would say. I understand all that. I'm about to turn 60. I'm at the young side of that baby boomer generation.
Mm-hmm.
But Jeff, the reality is kingdom culture calls us out of our generational thinking, all of us,
Right.
to what does Jesus say? What is the kingdom of God about? It's very easy because we're kind of like that fish in the water. We're in a culture that we live in, particularly ours here in America, where we've been inundated with media and messages and confirmation bias through social media and all of those things. That sometimes we've been discipled by something other
Right.
than what we need to be discipled by. And I think if we could all center around the fact that Jesus said, go make disciples, that may really help us. I keep pulling us back to what did Jesus say?
Yeah.
What are we about?
That is so good, because that seems to be the perennial challenge that we've got to deal with, of pulling us back to the essence of the gospel. Now, you mentioned the 4-stage model, one of the that we use in missiology. One of the most important things we do in that is trying to enculturate the gospel into a new culture, to be able to communicate it in a way that connects with them. And it seems once we do that, we'll spend the rest of the life of the church trying to deculturize the gospel so they can actually hear the gospel instead of their culture. And how are you going about doing that here in your context? If you're talking about trying to shift or modify a cultural issue, that's like changing the weather. You're trying to have a cataclysmic alteration of the weather patterns of the Foursquare Church. How are you going to do that?
Well, you're hitting the key thing, Jeff. And I try to appeal to the things we hold in common. Where are our points of agreement? And that's why I say getting back to the basics of what did Jesus say? There's a lot of things, one of the things I've always loved is Augustine's statement that our founder really grabbed hold of: in the essentials unity, and the non-essentials liberty, and all things charity.
Mm-hmm.
And getting back to the really important basics of making disciples. And what's interesting to me is I've interacted with a lot of denominations and networks and different people on this subject to see what others are doing. And there is the same common cry among all those that I talk to. And everyone is recognizing that after 50 years of the church growth movement, we have to be honest and say, we have not attended to discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as we define, discipleship comes with so many different thoughts about what it is. And I've been studying this a lot. And one of the things I've come to is I think discipleship actually begins before what we call evangelism,
Right.
that we're discipling people. So we see this in the gospel. And it ends when we take our last breath. Spiritual formation and all of that added conversation and language that we've used, if you keep looking at it, it's all a part of disciple making.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we can look at the trajectory of Peter's life and see, he was impetuous and he had the strong, bold statements, and then he shied away, and then he has this huge, you can just see this of his life, but he ends up dying an old man in humility and
Mm-hmm.
said, I want to be crucified upside down, not like my Lord.
Yeah.
And so we see this progression. Well, he was a disciple all the way through.
Right.
And that's where I think we just need to simplify this and say it's basically until Christ is formed in us.
Yeah.
And that's a lifelong endeavor.
That's a long obedience in one direction, isn't it?
Exactly. Lifelong.
I was chatting with a pastor friend of mine this morning about this. He was asking me some questions about discipleship. And that's such a loaded question now because so many different ideas. I remember one leadership book I read that really popularized this idea that, well, discipleship is what you do to the new believer. You have to disciple the new believer, and then say, no, you actually have to be a disciple your whole life. That's just kind of your calling.
Exactly.
It's pursuing Christ your entire life.
Well, this is why I looked at the model, Jeff, that Jesus actually used. Because I see a lot of people's ideas about the model, but I thought, okay, so I've studied what psychology and human development teach about how people grow, and from a Christian perspective, of course. But then I went into, well, how did Jesus do it? And what I discovered is he had this model that's so aligned to how people grow. And that is, he's constantly teaching them because they needed a new mindset. And that requires a growth mindset, by the way, to
Right.
gain new knowledge. We all have to continually grow because it's challenging our biases and our mindsets. But then he did life with them. So as he's teaching them in the context of relationship. And the best way to turn insight of new knowledge into understanding is to be in relationship with somebody where you're processing that knowledge, where you're talking about, hey, I'm learning this, and they're pressing back on it with their perspective. That's what turns it from insight to understanding. But the third piece of this that I see that he did is he either took them or sent them on ministry practices. In other words, he sent them out to use their hands to do the thing he's been showing them and teaching them about. And then we see they would come back and debrief. Either on site, he'd be asking them questions. They'd be asking him questions. And of course, the classic is where he sends the 72 out and they come back and say, hey, even the demons were subject to us. And he reorients their ministry thinking right there when he says, wait a minute, that's not what we're celebrating. So we see this practice of Jesus of teaching, relationship, and reflective practice.
That's really
And that's how people grow.
So what incremental changes are you seeing happen now that you've been both in your own life as well as your influence as a leader within a movement? What are the incremental changes that you're watching develop that's giving you signs of hope that this is something that we all long for this. We all long for both our own internal faithfulness to Jesus and that others would be faithful disciples of his as well.
I think for me, Jeff, even through this very difficult year that we've all been going through and seems to be continuing a bit into 2021, I think it's brought us all back to what's important. I know people are longing for relationship more than ever before because of our isolation. I know that people are starting to say, things that I always was sure of don't work anymore. I need to think differently. And so I'm watching people hunger for a real basic relationship with Jesus and one another.
Hmm.
And so I'm one of these that I believe that God is in and at work in every single thing.
Hmm.
And so because of that, I have full confidence in what he's doing. And when I wrote this dissertation with all these practices about growth, I did some personal reflection. I went, oh, well, this is how I've always lived. I just didn't know. It was intuitive. I didn't know what to do. I've always had this growth culture. I pulled out the notes from the very first message I ever preached. I was 15 years old, and it was all about personal growth and development.
Is that right?
Yeah, and handwritten in pencil, my first notes. And I realized how the word becoming has always been so important to me. And
Mm.
when you learn that with grace, it takes grace, truth, and time to grow.
Yeah.
And when you do that over a lifetime, finishing well has always been the most important thing to me. And this is why I think it's a lifetime. And finishing well for me is more in love with Jesus,
Mm.
more character like Jesus, and more empowered in the ministry of Jesus than ever before in my lifetime.
Now, you and Gary pastored churches for, I think, 30, 38 years, something like that. You've also
Yes.
been a general supervisor in the denomination, a district supervisor. Now, after all this research and leadership that you've been doing for this season, if you were to go back and pastor again, what would you do different?
I've been thinking about that a lot. I would shape it from day one around these principles,
Mm.
Jeff, and I would keep it so simple. I would build in these three practices. How do people gain new knowledge, have deep community with one another, and practice what they're learning? Put into practice what they've heard and seen. And I would keep it just that simple. I believe that our focus on reaching the lost sometimes causes us to lose sight of what disciple making is about. And I think we've all seen the numbers of addition versus multiplication.
Right.
And disciple making is about multiplication.
Hmm.
And
Well,
I've watched it, believe it.
yeah. Now, so as you would be unpacking that now within the movement, what are some of the things that you're looking at to anchor these changes into the culture so that it just doesn't become another policy or proposal or God forbid your dissertation just does like everybody else's and goes on the shelf and nobody ever reads it?
Yeah.
How do you anchor
Well,
it into the culture?
it is the greatest challenge. It really is. And that's where when I did the historical research, I saw so many leadership development programs come and go. And I looked through all the archives and I went, man, we've had some great stuff. Why have we not stuck with anything? And I think part of it is that's why I've used the word culture
Mm.
instead of initiatives or programs. And I'm trying to discern what really changes culture. It doesn't happen quickly, Jeff.
No,
I mean, the
no.
reality is it probably won't happen in my lifetime, but I can take steps toward it. And that's why I saw these uh, culture markers in organizations that did it well. And I will tell you, I've called it the crown jewel, but there's one church that emerged that I've become very well acquainted with. And it's so interesting the way it's designed because it's not anything like anything I've ever seen. And it's 40 years old.
Hmm.
So it's not some new idea to see how it lasts. It's
Mm-hmm.
lasted 40 years and it's in its second generation of leadership. And it's unlike anything I've ever seen. And the humility and yet the depth of spiritual maturity in the congregation is striking.
What Unpack that some? What Paint us a picture? Give us some examples of what you're
Sure.
talking
They
about.
started 40 years ago with 7 couples in a living room. They started with polycentric leadership, so they don't have a senior pastor.
Mm-hmm.
They have an elder board, and they have a large team now of leadership that focuses on their gifts. In other words, they lead out of their gifting, not out of a hierarchy. They have a rotating teaching team. They have rotating worship teams. They have rotating ministry teams. The pastors are so healthy because the way that they share leadership and the load and the responsibility. Their ministry is solely focused on changing the heart and soul of their region and the world. And their mission is they do this by producing and releasing spiritual leaders who know and express the authentic Christ. And when I interviewed them and I asked them, how do you define a spiritual leader? They said, a maturing disciple with a kingdom focus. And their sole emphasis is producing and releasing these spiritual leaders.
And is this a Foursquare Church?
No, it isn't.
Okay.
It's an independent church.
Because that I've been thinking a lot about that. I was talking with John Goldingay this week and about this issue. He wrote about leadership. And, I don't know if you've ever read his article that he wrote on is leadership biblical? And, he comes from an Episcopal background. And of course, our polity is Episcopal as well. And we place a lot of authority and focus on the senior pastor. And part of his premise was that that's not biblical, according to him. And I think you could make an argument that whether it's not biblical or biblical, I think you could make the argument that the models that we see at least in the New Testament is more of a plurality, and it more of a, like what you were describing, this situation. And that would be a massive culture shift. I don't think we'd necessarily have to do an organizational realignment on that, but it's a cultural shift.
It is.
The mindset of doing it like you just described, which I think would be fascinating, because he had one line in there that just captured my mind. He said, if we embrace this way, we may not get as much done, but we may not sin as much either.
Interesting thought. I actually have been discussing this too, and I understand the risk in saying so and being misunderstood, Jeff.
Right.
But I will tell you, I started thinking back, when I was a kid in church, we never talked about leadership. We never called them leaders. They were pastors, they were deacons, they were ministers. The word leadership really came to the fore probably in the 80s when I remember the church growth movement. We began teaching these things. But leadership to me is a function, not a title or an office. And I would say in this church that I'm referencing, there is leadership.
Right.
But it's not a headship in the same idea. And what we talk about is Jesus is the leader and Lord of the church.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of us are all members of his body that function according to the gift and calling and assignment that he's given us together. And that's what I appreciate about this church. First of all, people say, well, that's probably that couldn't work in a large setting. Well, they're not sure right now, but they're somewhere in the area of 13 to 15,000 people. This is the second generation of leadership that they transitioned 10 years ago, and it's just continuing to grow and thrive. It is such a strong culture of growing people. There is a singular message. I asked them, how do you measure this mission of yours? How would you measure it? Because you don't really count attendance close enough. You know that you've got some 23,000 people that have gone through your training center in different courses and environments. But how do you measure it? And every single one of them said, stories of transformation. We are all trained to listen and look for stories of transformation. And then the way we tell our stories, through video, through written ways, through who we platform, you name it, we tell the stories over and over again. And I said, so how do you know when you're in mission drift? And they said, when we're not seeing or hearing stories. And they gave me 2 examples of areas in the church right now where they're not hearing many stories of transformation, and they're going after it, trying to discover what's going on.
Very interesting.
Mhm.
Now, you've got a deep passion for the emerging generation, younger people. One of the things that I've noticed about younger leaders, and I don't know where to draw the line on what makes an older leader and younger leader. My whole life was always spent, the culture I got saved into, it was always to be an elder, and young people don't know anything, and you have to be a spiritual elder.
Mhm.
And then somewhere in there I became, I guess, a spiritual elder, but everybody changed their mind and said our focus is on young people now. It's like always a day late and a dollar short. But I have noticed that the young people today, younger leaders, are, whenever I've talked to them about planting churches or doing, they want to do it, but they don't want to do it alone.
Exactly.
It's like they don't have that drive to go out and be what we'd say, they don't have the drive to go out and be the senior pastor to pioneer and plant, but they have a
Right.
deep passion to do that if they could
Yes,
do it on a team.
exactly.
Now, do you see a way that this is, for shaping the future of going after the younger people that seem to be already hardwired for this? Do you see a way that this could be unpacked within our own movement for the up and coming generations?
Yeah, definitely so, Jeff. I see it emerging, spending quite a bit of time at LPU and teaching the polity class right now. And I'm seeing this emerge in the mentality of younger leaders. And I think it's really by design what God is doing in this season. We were talking about baby boomers a little earlier. I believe that God designs every generation for what that generation needs. So
Hmm.
I don't point fingers at any generation, and every generation is needed simultaneously.
Right, exactly.
I'm saying to the elders right now, you know what? We all need to realize that we've been called to be the sage. And the sage has grown in wisdom and Christ-likeness. And just their presence is weighty
Hmm.
and brings stability and is important and says just the right thing at the right time. The sage doesn't need to be on the stage. We can be, but we don't feel the need to be
Right.
because we feel the power of embracing the young, empowering, encouraging, applauding them, helping guide them when they need it. And by the way, they want it. They
Hmm.
really do.
They do.
And there's a beautiful sense of stepping aside, making room for more, and applauding others and enjoying as we watch the fruitfulness from generation to generation. When people ask me, all we do is talk about young now, are we putting old people aside? Absolutely not. If we do that, we're foolish.
Right.
But we do need to recognize the role
Yeah.
of the sage and where that is most effective.
Yeah. So true. So true. And I think as I'm entering into that phase of my life chronologically now, I think the same thing. I think of the time, I had the fire in the belly, to do certain things.
Yes.
Now I'm
Yes.
going, I just want to get home before it gets dark because it's hard to drive at night.
Exactly. That's why, I say, really, I don't have the energy I had 30 years ago.
Yeah.
These young guys have the energy and they have the ability. What we have is the life experience. And
Yeah.
and prayerfully, Jeff, I really love Bobby Clinton's leadership emergence theory. And sometimes people misunderstand and think he's just saying if you get old, you're going to get into convergence. Well, no, what he's saying is you have to cooperate with God in the process.
Right.
What we become, life shapes us, all of us. We determine how. And does it make us more like Christ or does it make us just old and cranky?
Yeah.
And my goal is that I would be able to be that sage with wisdom and be there to help and support and strengthen and give counsel and warning when I see them running off a cliff like I used to do. But to let them run because I just don't have the energy the same anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's by design by God.
I agree. I totally agree. And finding that joy of, we're both grandparents, and
Yes.
what a great joy that is.
Yes, it is.
And, and not only spirit, not only in the natural, but in the spiritual as well, that
That's right.
it's like when John wrote to 1 John, again, nothing delights me more than my children are walking in the truth.
Exactly.
Yeah. And how one of the things that caught me reading John, he regularly said, I'm writing to you older men. This was the gendered translations that, has been
Mm-hmm.
worked out now, but I'm
Right.
writing to you older men because you have wisdom. I'm writing to you young men because you have strength. You have, and
Exactly.
he named 3 generations. And we all need sons, brothers, and fathers. We all need
Yes,
daughters, sisters, and mothers.
exactly.
That the kingdom of God is a relationship.
Yes. Yes.
Now,
Everything you've just been talking about, by the way, is culture,
hmm,
because there are cultures that are monogenerational, monogender, monoethnicity.
right.
All of these things affect the environment you have. And that's where I think culture is a good word, is environment. It's the soil in which something grows.
Hmm,
If we think of that literal word of where culture came from, it was an environment even of a petri dish and what would grow in this environment. It's as simple as when a seed is planted in the earth, there's 3 aspects of soil that have to be in the right condition for the seed to grow. It has to get the right amount of sun, the right amount of water. That's what culture is.
hmm,
Something will grow, no matter, everybody is involved in a culture. We have
right.
set culture whether we intend to or not. And something will grow. We can decide whether we want to be intentional
Yeah.
so that Christ likeness grows or something else grows.
So in your your current assignment, if you were outrageously successful, what do you hope
Mm.
to accomplish?
What I hope to accomplish, Jeff, is that every Foursquare minister comes to the place where they feel seen and known and valued, but also expected to grow and feel a sense of responsibility and accountability to grow in every way, to be like Christ. And this is the way I'm talking about discipleship in these ways, that our loves would be reordered to align to the Great Commandment, that our character would be reformed to the fullness of the image of Christ, which is the fruit of the Spirit,
Hmm,
and that our purposes would be realigned to the ministry of Christ and his kingdom on earth.
hmm.
If every Foursquare minister would just have that heart to be and to make of others in intentional relationship with one another, I just have a sense that God will take those people and assign them all over the earth in all kinds of ministries,
Mhm.
and we'll be the faithful presence of Christ in our part of the world.
What are there resources that you would recommend if somebody's wanting to dig in deeper into some of this? It struck a real chord with them, and you said, here are 1, 2, 3 resources, maybe books or something that you would recommend.
I've read so many that it would be hard to stop, Jeff. I think anything right now that's talking about spiritual formation and
Hmm.
discipleship, and there's so many new things. I love J.R. Woodward's Creating a Missional Culture, and he actually deals with disciple making. He talks about polycentric leadership.
Hmm.
He gives even the gifts of the church around apostle, prophet, evangelist, teacher. He gives really new and fresh language to those and to their purposes and functions in the church. So that's one of my favorites because it kind of
Okay.
addresses all of these things at one. I love Jamie Smith's book on You Are What You Love.
Okay.
I'm coming to really appreciate that. There's one I'm reading right now called The Sacred Overlap. And it's talking about the Venn diagram and that sweet spot in the middle of, instead of an either or culture that we tend to be, it's a both and. And then recently, I just read Rich Viotis's book on a deeply formed life, and it was excellent.
Okay, those are great resources. You've mentioned a few times the growth mindset. Have you been impacted by the work of Carolyn Dweck on that? I think she
Yes,
wrote a book.
that's exactly it.
Yeah, that's a great resource as well.
Yeah,
Well,
and that comes into that fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. And I just believe as followers of Jesus, we don't have the opportunity to have a fixed mindset.
right.
He's called us to be transformed.
Yeah, to always be renewed. Well,
Yes.
Tammy, this is your second time on the podcast. So I've already asked you my time machine question about what advice you would give to your 25-year-old self. So I'm gonna twist it around. I'm gonna flip it this time. We're gonna get in that same time machine, and today we're gonna go to your funeral. And people are standing around your casket or your urn, and they're talking about Tammy Dunahoo. What do you want them to say?
She lived in the goodness of God.
That works. Well, Tammy, thank you so much for being with us. It's been always a joy and a delight to talk with you.
Thanks, Jeff. You too.
Hey, before we go, I want to remind you that you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. Also, I'd like to encourage you to share this episode on social media or through email. Get your friends and family involved if you think it'll help them. And finally, if you benefit from this podcast and or you believe in our ministry of making disciples of nations by developing healthy Foursquare Church planting movements, would you consider partnering with us in prayer and even financial support? Go to my website, JeffRoper.com, and you'll see the link there that says support our work. We would appreciate it. It helps make this ministry possible. God bless you guys. It's your life. Now go live it.